I'm here today with Doug Peters. Doug and I have been friends for quite some time, back to the days when I was supporting Frederick Buechner and his family in the development of the Frederick Buechner Center. And Doug has got an even further back history with Fred. And so we thought that it would really be timely, given Mr. Buechner's passing on August 15th, for the two of us to have a chat about all the deep, rich relationship that Doug and Fred had together. So Doug, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. It's good to be here. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So this format's going to be a little bit different than what, we usually do in book interviews, but we just thought it was just too important to pass up this opportunity. So maybe, Doug, you could start by just telling people your background, what you've been doing for the last X number of years.
Well, I'm like a lot of people who were influenced by Fred's work. I'm retired clergy, United Methodist clergy, and I retired about 12 years ago. So I've been out of the business for a while. But I served for about 35 years, always in Iowa, different places in Iowa. I was influenced by Fred in a variety of ways, but I'm also a songwriter. So a lot of the songs that I wrote and actually performed years ago were influenced by some of his works. And in fact, the very first letter I got from him, first letter I sent to him, was asking permission to use some of his images. And he wrote back and gave me that opportunity. So a lot of songs come from that. And then since that time, since my retirement, my wife and I have been living in Italy a good part of the year. And in fact, we go back to our home in Umbria in 2 days with our I keep saying our 21-year-old Maine Coon cat. And at some point I won't be able to include that in the bio. We're amazed that we can still include that in the bio, but she's something. So she'll get on the plane with us and hang in there.
Wow.
So and then I've been doing my own writing. Just finished writing a novel, not set in the town where we live in central Italy, as well as some other poetry and that sort of thing. So
Wow.
That's a little bit about it.
So going back many years, how did you first even hear of Frederick Buechner?
It was in Iowa. We attended some sort of it was a worship conference or something that somebody in our denomination sponsored, and so I attended, like a lot of us did. And this guy was talking about this author that he was just excited about, and I'd never heard of, Frederick Buechner. And he started quoting some passages or some parts from his book, Telling the Truth, The Gospel is Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale. And so it was like a 2-day conference. So there was a bookstore set up, and I went out and bought the book that night, and this is it. And still hanging together. And I read the whole thing that night, cover to cover.
Wow.
Who is this guy? And it's as much about how he wrote as what he wrote. I was hearing these stories in such a human way. And I was so taken by it. And I'm not saying anything new to people who have read him, as hundreds and probably thousands have. But that was where I started. And that was in 78, I think. And so I don't know, it probably shortly thereafter, maybe the next few months, is when I finally wrote to him asking for permission to use some of the images about Abraham and Sarah. It tells a great story about Abraham and Sarah as old parents, which I thought was wonderful.
So you mentioned that you write songs, and I know that somewhere there's a video out there that we found of you performing one of the songs that you wrote based on,
That's right. That was I know which one you're talking about. So on the website, or was at least, I think it was my song Pieta, which was from the Peculiar Treasures series. He asked me this is kind of a little further in the story, when he got to know me and when I would send him, in those days, cassette tapes back and forth so he could hear what the song sounded like. He asked me if I would consider writing songs based on his book, Peculiar Treasures. And so I have a number of songs about biblical characters. And that video you're talking about, I'll tell you, I was scared to death. I was, he had invited me to appear with him on the Sunday Evening Club.
Yeah, and Chicago Sunday Evening Club. Yeah,
Chicago Sunday Evening Club, which aired for I didn't know much about it. Once I started researching it, once he asked me to do that, I thought, holy cow, the people who've been on that show. And he wanted me to do a couple songs. And because when we toured together, which we'll get to, I'm sure, a little later on,
Yeah.
that's what I was. I was the manager. I was the chauffeur. I was the opening act. I was the whatever. So we had done that. So I played the couple songs, and one of them is Pietà. And the reason I was so scared to death, I'm a songwriter, but I'm more of a writer than a performer, even though I've done a lot of performing. I never memorize anything. So they had these 3 cameras zooming in all over the place in Chicago at this station. It impressed me. And I said, I'm going to crash and burn here. It was all taped, so that was fortunate. But what I had done, if it looks like I'm steering only one way, I had taken a piece of paper and written the guitar chords, and I'd stuck it on the bottom of one of the cameras because I was afraid. Fred wasn't in the room when I did this. They taped me earlier, and then they spliced it in. So I didn't really see him. I guess I saw him off stage when he was being interviewed. Then that night we were invited over to somebody's house for dinner. I told them why I looked so nervous, as I'm telling you and now whoever.
So, after you first heard of him, you approached him first about, a song, but you wrote letters back and forth for, I guess, decades.
Years. Yeah, I would say I probably have at least 35 years worth of letters back and forth. And it wasn't, I had never counted up how many I have. I may have, somewhere between 30 and 50, something like that. And if you've ever seen a letter from him, he always wrote in longhand. Oh, here I had one I thought I'd show you. This is the very first letter I got. I don't know if you can see it. But
it was typically very difficult to read.
Oh, typically for years. And, and so what I've done, I've typed everything out on the computer, so I remember exactly what he said. But he would always write in a felt tip pen. And that was kind of his thing, and wouldn't write very much. But I do remember when he first got his first computer. And the reason I know that is because there's some letters that in the old dot matrix days, he was putting out on that. And it's sort of like a word was here and then a word was here. So, and then he went back to writing longhand. But but we would back and forth, and as many of your listeners know, it was rare that somebody who wrote to him did not receive a reply.
Yes,
he was very gracious that way. So
he was. Everything I've always heard from everyone says that. But kind of like being a pastor, how would you say he influenced your profession and your life?
Well, I've heard it said that he, at some certain point, he was the most quoted writer for many clergy. Certainly was for me. I tried to be careful not to quote him every single Sunday because it's kind of people see a pattern there. But there's sometimes, particularly if the text had to do with a certain story about a biblical character, how could you not draw on that well of great insight in the stories he would tell? How could you not draw sometimes on one of his novels when he takes a characteristic, and he had this wonderful gift of finding the worst and the best in characters and seeing that they were side by side.
Yes.
So terribly flawed. Peculiar treasures. It says it right there. We're all of us peculiar and we're treasures. And that was his view of God. He knew a scoundrel. He could spot him from, half mile away, and he somehow would see the treasure in that. Sometimes I spot only the scoundrel. I'm not as gracious sometimes as he found himself being. But
well, he was an amazingly gifted writer. there's just no question about that for anybody that's looked at his work. Just profound.
Well, and he was a real humility about him. I think he always was surprised that he had actually pulled it off. He was actually surprised that people really gained that much from him. One time I wrote him, I can't remember which book it was about, probably one of the book like Magnificent Defeat or Hungering Dark, one of those. And it had sermons in it. And he says, dear heaven, dear God, or good God in heaven, or however you would say, he said, I'm still amazed or still delighted those old things still have some life in them. So he did. I don't think he had remotely thought that his works were timeless.
Huh.
He
Wow.
would, one time I do remember him saying, and he would say this sometimes in his appearances, he would say, I apologize, or I'm well aware that I, I didn't, my language is masculine because I came from that period.
Yeah.
God is masculine, he, him, that sort of thing. And he would say, if I had to do all over again, I would do it differently. But I think that might have concerned him that maybe he might have become irrelevant. But clearly that wasn't the case. But he made no bones about it. Now he would have written that differently had he been, a little later on.
Well, I didn't read any of his work until, I started working on his behalf. And so maybe around 2010, maybe was the first time I'd read anything. And, Secrets in the Dark, which, is a compilation of his sermons and lectures and essays that includes some of the ones that were contained in the books that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I, to this day, that's still the most important, meaningful book I've ever read.
That's amazing.
And I've read, tons of theological, spiritual related books by now. So, I just, I'm still astounded basically about what he did in his career.
Yeah. Well, I think he was surprised that he would ever be doing anything that would smack of religion. Some days he liked to smack religion around a little bit. He was always frustrated in what we have done with religion. Sometimes he would say things like, well, sometimes a good AA meeting would be more meaningful to the church. And of course, where he'd go there because of the death of his father, who was an alcoholic and committed suicide, as most everybody knows. But he started out wanting to be a novelist, and his journey just meandered, and he heard George Buttrick preach in New York, and that really turned it a bit. So
beyond the letters, how did you and Fred become friends?
Well, that's it. I was I'm right now in Iowa City, Iowa, and one of my earlier churches was just about a little less than half hour north of here, in the town of Solon. And I was there for 19 years, and this was back in the mid 80s probably. I was doing a lot of concert work, still not memorizing things, still having that music all over the place. But churches would have me in and sing my songs, and I almost always would say what was based on Fred's work, or and that were a number of them. So anyway, one day I don't exactly know where I had been singing. I think it probably was up in Cedar Rapids, First Lutheran Church, because later on a woman from First Lutheran Church called me and asked if I would come to a meeting, because they were having a major celebration in their church, and they wanted to invite Frederick Buechner to come and be a part of that. And as far as they knew, I was the only person they could think of that even knew how to contact him. And so I thought,
not surprising.
Yeah, well, I just don't know, because I did that for me. I'm pretty selfish. I'm a selfish guy, Brian. I did it for me. But so I said, well, okay, I would go there. I didn't know why they wanted me there. Well, what they wanted him to do, it's a big church, First Lutheran. They have a very nice library. They were going to celebrate the 35th anniversary, not of their church, of their library. And they said, why? Maybe you could get Frederick Buechner to come and speak at a celebration for our church library. And he's in Vermont, and we're in Iowa. I said, I can't imagine he'd do that. I mean, I don't know. I've never talked with him. I've just written letters. I said, well, and this woman was very persuasive. And she said, no, please do this. And I said, well, okay, I'll try. I'll write him a letter. And he wrote, I think he wrote back anyway. And he was not enthused. But she said, we need to call him. You can't get somebody to do anything just by a letter. You got to call a person. So somehow we found his number, and I was again scared to death again because I never talked to him. So I called him, and he picked up the phone. I don't know if you've ever heard on some of the video you have with the website, you've heard how he sounds. But so I said who I was, and he was happy to hear my voice. And I said, well, I'm calling for this church, and they would love for you to come speak. And it's the occasion of the 35th anniversary of the library. And he paused. He says, well, my heavens. He kind of talked with kind of husky. My heavens. how long would this be? Well, and she had told me, she said, let's see if we can get him to come and he can speak at other churches. See if he'll come for 3 weeks. I said, you got to be kidding.
Oh
3
my
weeks.
gosh.
So I'm on the phone with him. I said, well, they would like you to come for 3 weeks. And I thought he might climb through the phone and strangle me.
Yeah, really?
3 weeks. My God, man, how could I possibly come for, I could only come for the at most 10 days. 10 days. And that's how it worked.
Oh
and
my
so
goodness.
that committee went to work, and I was determined I would be the kind of his guide and his chauffeur. So we toured around, it was mostly Eastern Iowa for 10 days. And we spoke at colleges and we spoke in churches. Well, he spoke, I did the opening act, as I said. And that was, I took a whole box of all the books I had that he had written at that time. I said, your job, is to, before you go to bed, sign a bunch of these, which he did. He signed every single book I have, except I think maybe one he didn't sign. So, and because you like story, let me give you a couple stories from.
Sure.
He's very distinguished. Very proper, but he's also extraordinarily funny. And by this time we were getting along pretty well, because we had virtually every day, all day together. Well, we were staying at a historic Redstone Inn in Dubuque, Iowa. And he had given a lecture in the afternoon, and we were going to have some banquet or something in the evening. So he said, I'm going to go down to my room. I want to take a nap. He said, would you come down and knock on my door at 4:30? I think it was 4:30. I said, sure, I'll do that. So he went down to his room. I was in my room, closed the door. Well, I'm watching about, I wasn't going to knock on the door any earlier because this was wearing for him. So at exactly 4:30, I stand up, open my door, and there he is. He was either standing there this far from the door or on his knees. And I jumped because I'm not expecting to see him. He planned this whole thing. And he started laughing. He says, I always wanted to do that to somebody. Then he stood up and we went on as if nothing had happened.
Oh my goodness.
It did remind me of that at the time. But it was kind of like that. He would joke about things as well as be very serious about things. He would say, if he'd had too much, he would say, lean into my ear, he said, okay, can you get me out of here? And so we'd get out of there. So,
well, I obviously, worked on his behalf for several years to bring him online and, do various things to introduce him to a new generation of readers. And that trip that you and he went on is the only one of that kind that I'm aware of his entire career. I mean, he went to speak plenty of places, but more like, either one-time deals or like he was at Laity Lodge for a week at a time, a couple times, but nothing like a book tour, or anything like that.
Well, he did. We had good crowds. I imagine they sold a lot of books and he autographed a lot. He met a lot of people. I still kind of pinch myself that happened that way. It would never have happened had I been able to talk this woman in Cedar Rapids out of this crazy idea that turned out to be one of the best ideas ever. And in fact, later he met her too, and she's since passed. A wonderful human being, and she'd get right in his face, not in a bad way. Just she was just right there, and she'd tell him how great it was he was there, and he'd kind of back away because she was just so present, and again, not in anything other than just a most marvelous way. And he would say, after this tour, we talked a number of times. He would say, oh, do you remember that woman? What was her name? Can you remind me of her name? I'd remind him, oh, wasn't she something? I said, yes, she was. You wouldn't have been there had she not been part of it.
So in all the years since then, you and Fred stayed in touch.
We did. I saw him a couple times at his home in Vermont with my wife, Martha. The last time I saw him was in Vermont. He was beginning to fail some, I thought, but he was still his presence was still like it always was. First time we were there in Vermont, he liked to show people around because where he lives is a big kind of a preserve that was really, I think, part of Judy's family in the past. And so he had an old Army Jeep, And so he said to get in. I put Martha in the front seat and I was in the back. And he probably liked it that way better anyway. So we go in the hills. And this is one of these Jeeps where the window folds down like you, and he's all over those hills and pointing where the maple trees are. He was in seventh heaven and we were too. And the second visit, we didn't do anything like that because it was just mostly in his office or in his, we didn't even go into the library, which he called the Magic Kingdom.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you about the Magic Kingdom.
We saw that the first time. We were in the Magic Kingdom the first time. And but where he writes is not in that library.
Right.
There's a room, which is basically all white with a window. There's almost nothing in it, at least when we were there. And he has a story about a license plate he saw one time.
Yes.
Called Trust.
Yes.
Faith.
I was just talking about this with someone else recently.
Oh, okay. Well, I saw that license plate hangs in that place where he writes, or did at that time.
Uh-huh.
So we didn't spend a great deal of time the second time. The middle time I saw him, which was by myself, I was on sabbatical leave, and was riding trains all over the country. I'd kind of devised this thing to make up where I wanted to go. And he and Judy were down in their home in Florida. They have a home on the coast in Florida. And we made arrangements that I would come and during this whole business of taking trains all over the country, stop and see them. And I did, and we had lunch. And then that time he didn't have an Army Jeep, but he had a golf cart. So we got in the golf cart. We drove all around this Jupiter Island where he lived, and where I'm assuming the family still has that place. And he showed me places, little church where he liked to go. He showed me different people who had an influence on him. He showed me, I think it was there where he wrote that book, The Storm.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so it kind of where that influence came from. And then after lunch, I got in my car and headed back to the train, and off we went.
So for people not familiar with the Magic Kingdom, could you tell people a little bit of what that's like?
Well, it's been a lot of years since I've been in it. He and Judy have this wonderful, wonderful place where they live in Vermont. And there's a quite separate building, which is his library, where he collects all the books you imagine he would have. And I think he's proud of, I think it's the first edition Moby Dick. And he was a huge fan of the Oz series. I grew up on the movie, The Wizard of Oz. It took me a lot of time to realize there's more than just that movie. But he has the Oz books and all these books that meant a great deal to him when he was young, because books for him were his way of kind of making sense out of the world. I mean, you imagine you have your parents and your one brother, Jamie, and then one day as young boys, you find your father has committed suicide, and all of a sudden you're adrift. And he had grandparents and whatnot. But I think where he could find great solace, not the only place, but where one of the places he found great solace was in books. And so before he wrote anything, he read everything. So it's a beautiful room. He has easy chairs in there. And for those of us who are clergy or anybody who likes books, we would dream of a place like this. I don't remember it being extraordinarily large. It's not like it's, a city library, but bookcases to the ceiling and just a place where you go and big windows. You can look out on these hillside in Vermont. He lived in a gorgeous part of Vermont. That's what I remember about it primarily. Just a wonderful place to spend time.
So when you learned about his passing, how did you feel?
It's really odd. I've been thinking about this for a couple of years because, I mean, he died at 96. So, I can do the math. So, it can't be forever. And I started thinking I didn't know how I would learn, and I didn't know exactly what I would feel. I mean, he really was my mentor. Like he was a lot of people's mentor. Each of us have people who made a difference in our lives. And so the way I found out was I was scrolling through Facebook one morning. I guess I didn't imagine it would be on something like Facebook. I can't imagine he would have thought, yeah, Facebook is where the world's going to go. It wouldn't have been his style, I don't think. But that's where I found out. I was scrolling through, I think it was the Buechner Center, and it said in memoriam. And I we have a place where we have breakfast here. We look out over a little pond, and I was out there having coffee, and Martha was in the other room just about to come out, I think. And I said, oh no. And she heard me say that. And I just, it was one of those things that you knew was going to happen. And then I thought, it's come to an end. And I guess I felt a couple of things, obviously great loss, but I thought, haven't thousands of us been really fortunate? Really, I mean, I've had some experiences a lot of people haven't had, but a lot of people have had experiences with, they have their own letter, or they have their own meeting, the book signing, or they have their own paragraph or chapter where something that didn't make sense before or resonated within them, and from that moment on, their life was a little different.
Mm-hmm.
And that never again would we have anything fresh, but we would always have this body of work and memories and whatnot. So that's a pretty long answer for your brief question. That's what I recall.
It felt kind of surreal for me.
Did it?
Yeah. I mean, I
Because
was in Chautauqua at the time.
we exchanged some emails at that time.
Yeah.
How did you find out?
Through an email. And so, and I heard, I kept hearing from lots of other people when they heard
Sure.
about it. I'd get an email or I'd get a message somehow. And, and I was at Chautauqua, for the week,
Right.
listening to lectures and things like that. And the day before we arrived at Chautauqua was when Salman Rushdie got attacked.
Amazing.
So it was already kind of surreal up there when we arrived on Saturday. And then, Fred's passing was on Monday.
Right.
And so, I was not at home. I was in a different environment than I'm usually at. This kind of surprising major events both happened, and it's like, so I don't know. I don't know how to process it really further than that.
Well, and you really were in a very unique situation following the stabbing of Mr. Rushdie.
Yeah.
And, yeah, no, I can't imagine all that juxtaposition for you and for those folks there that might have also known who Frederick Buechner was.
Yeah, there was clearly some, but
Right.
So anything else that you'd like to share about your memories of Fred or your times together or anything?
Oh, that's I guess the only other thing I would say, a couple things. When he was here in Iowa, when we were traveling, we stopped at my house in Solon where I lived then. I remember that it was towards the end of our time together, and he was kind of tired. So we stopped, and he says, can I just rest at your house? And I said, yeah, you can rest at my house. I was single then, so it was me at my house. And so, which was the church parsonage where I was living. And so he got in, and he said, I'm going to lie down. He went in my bedroom, lay down on my bed for, I don't know, half hour just to get his wits about him. And then he hopped up, and we went on down into Iowa City. And he said, I want to know, what's the best bookstore? And I said, well, for me, there's only one in Iowa City. It's Prairie Lights Bookstore. And I'm happy to make a shameless plug for Prairie Lights Bookstore. And I said, let's go in and see how many of your books they have. Unfortunately, they had a couple. That was really good. And he said, well, that's great. He says, I've seen my books. He said, I want to get something for you. I said, what do you mean? He said, no, I want to get something for you. He said, one of the most famous people who studied at the Writers' Workshop here in Iowa City was Flannery O'Connor. Do you have Flannery O'Connor's anything of hers? I said, I really don't. He says, say no more. And he often liked to say that, say no more. So he looked around, and about this. This is a book of Flannery O'Connor's full works that he bought, and he bought it for me. Huh. And then he inscribed it. It says, for Doug Peters, from his friend and traveling companion, with grace to him and peace. And then I said, tell me about how to read this book, because he talks a lot about Flannery O'Connor a lot. And so in the back page, he said, see, it's all in pencil. He said, I would read it this way. He started telling me what he liked, what stories moved him most. He said, but he said, jump in any place. He says, include the letters because you can't go wrong. And I thought, all this, and he buys me a book, which really moved me. And the last thing I'll say is there's a tradition that I started, it's been 10, 15 years ago, on his birthday, which was July 11th. And I don't know, I think I know how it started, but I started sending him roses on his birthday every year. And the reason I think I started is because when we were traveling on this book extravaganza, he called it our barnstorming tour of Iowa. One time we stopped at I think it was the Redstone Inn again in Dubuque, and there was a vase of red roses, and the were there, and the person gave it to me and said somebody had sent them to me, and he says, "Good heavens, man, who sent you roses?" And I was actually dating somebody then. It didn't turn out well, but it's nonetheless, he was always impressed. And I never get into roses.
Oh goodness!
And so that's about all I remember of that exchange. And I think that's what led to it. And I would every year would send him roses, and he would write back thanking me for the roses and remembering something of our years in the past. And then when it got later, when I think his health was just it was not as easy for him to write. Judy would write the letters, and either he would dictate or she would write for both of them. And this year I sent roses on July 11th, and I didn't hear from him, which I never expected to hear from him. It just was, he always did. And then of course I heard on the 15th of August that he had died. So I plan to still send roses, I think, to Judy, because think how she shared her husband and their family, their daughters and sons-in-law and grandchildren, really shared this man selflessly in many ways, for which we were all very grateful.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Doug, I really appreciate you spending some time to share all this. It's an insight into a man who was very private, and a lot of folks didn't have the kind of relationship with him that you did. Most of us, it was just reading his incredible work, his incredible books. But I really appreciate your sharing your stories of all the times you spent together with Fred.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's great to see you and to catch up with you a little bit. And it's an honor. It's an honor to be featured on your program.
Thanks so much.
Okay, take care, friend. Bye-bye.